morning, everybody. Lena, thank you so much for hosting us, and to TERI University, and also to BRAC University for being a co-host of the South Asia Sustainable Development Solutions Network. I'm really delighted to be together with all of you and looking forward to a very active discussion and brainstorming today. I'm also eager to hear more details about the high-level political forum, because this is a core part of a basic transition that we are in now that may or may not be successful, and whose success depends on us to an important extent. And that is the idea of moving to a new kind of development agenda globally, one that is more holistic, more realistic, more balanced across topics, sectors, challenges, and more balanced between and among countries of the world. And 2015 is meant to be the transition point. It is both the end of the Millennium Development Goal period and the beginning of the Sustainable Development Goal era, if we get there. These goals are yet to be secured. The high-level political forum which will govern this process is yet to be finalized by all means. There are big challenges, and we're brought together in that context. Secretary General Ban Ki-moon established this global network in the immediate aftermath of the Rio +20 summit. Just as the governments had decided that there would be sustainable development goals, the Secretary General thought it would be useful if there were also solutions to achieve those goals. And so our purpose is to help find solutions. Partly to find solutions that make sense within South Asia, both the individual countries and the region as a whole, and also solutions that can learn from this region and benefit from many initiatives, technologies, and ideas that are emanating from this region. So the SDSN for South Asia should be a forum that accomplishes at least three things. One is to empower individual countries. A second is to help build regional cooperation. And third is to help build South Asia's global leadership on these issues. So what I'd like to do in this introductory few minutes is to describe the challenges of sustainable development as I understand them. I'll try to be brief, as people who generously suffered my long lecture a couple of days ago at the India International Center will know. I can go on for several hours or several days on this topic. So at some point the hook has to come out and say, stop. It is my favorite topic. I carry on for a long time about it, but I'll try to be brief. And then in the afternoon, I'll have another chance for a few minutes to talk about the network more specifically. First, I think we should define the region broadly, and my suggestion would be the SAARC countries would be the right starting point for us. That means that my initial map isn't quite right, that Myanmar would be part of a Southeast Asia network, and I was just looking at the UN's classification of Southern Asia. That includes Iran, but that would be part of a different network as well. So if SAARC is the right classification, I don't know if the Maldives are represented here today, but I would like that to be part of our task to make sure that we really are represented by all of the countries. I start inevitably with the statement of President Kennedy that for me resonates very powerfully, because I really do think it defines our time and defines our challenge. He said in the inaugural address that mankind holds in our mortal hands the ability to end all forms of human poverty and all forms of human life. And that, to my mind, is really the paradox of modernity and of our generation. And while nuclear war was very much on his mind in that statement, environmental catastrophe is also on our mind more than was the case in 1961 when President Kennedy first made this statement. I think he was prescient because we really can end extreme poverty. This is one of the big tasks for South Asia. It is the second epicenter of extreme poverty in the world, the first being sub-Saharan Africa, but there still is a lot of extreme poverty in this region. It is coming down. It could be eliminated. That clearly is the highest priority, at least in my opinion, for all of our work. But to sustain any victories against poverty means addressing the other dimensions of sustainable development. As you know well, when Dr. Brundtland first chaired the commission that put sustainable development on the global agenda, it was defined at that point in 1987 in intergenerational terms, that sustainable development means meeting the needs of the current generation in a way that enables future generations to meet their needs. I think that formulation has been improved upon by shifting from the intergenerational to the intersectoral definition, which I prefer. It comes to a similar point, but the sustainable development as is now being defined and reiterated constantly is sustainable development means a holistic approach that embodies economic development, social inclusion, and environmental sustainability. And I like that three-pillar approach. I think it makes it more clear. Of course, the environmental sustainability is part of the intergenerational reflection. And it's often said that there's a fourth pillar or at least a fourth foundation, and that's good governance. And I think that that's also a valid point. And when we think about governance, we want to think about governance both of the public sector and the private sector. Not just public sector governance, but good governance of the corporate sector, which now dominates the world economy. So for me, I try to start out with what's special about our time, because these are both ancient issues and very current issues. And I like to think of our challenges in terms of 5 main megatrends, if you will. First, that we really are dealing with global scale production and technological systems. The world economy is dominated by multinational companies. They're not the only players, but they're the most powerful players in the world, more powerful than governments. They own the governments, or at least they lease them out at a politician at a time. And they run the most effective foreign ministries, which are their international operations. Our foreign affairs ministries kind of know how to talk to each other, but multinational businesses actually know how to run things in 100 countries. So they're really the most effective organizations in the world, sometimes for good, often for disaster. And therefore, that's one of the key points that I think is a reality for us. Second is the information revolution, which in my view is still in its early days because we have breakthroughs of information technology which are breathtaking, but they have not yet been applied to problem solving adequately. The third is massive demographic change. This is still underway. I was looking for our region, South Asia. The data I'm about to quote includes Iran, but that would be small. For Southern Asia, the UN estimates that the population of this region was 492 million in 1950 and 1.79 billion in 2015. So this is a 3.5-fold rise of population in the region. By 2050, the estimate is 2.3 billion people in the region, and that would be the peak. on the medium fertility forecast, and ending the century at 2.2 billion. The other demographic upheaval for this region, of course, is urbanization. In 1950, the urbanization rate was 16% in South Asia. This was Gandhi's sea of villages. But by 2015, the urbanization rate has at least doubled. On the official data, it's 34%. But what's called rural here looks a lot like cities to me, by the way. India doesn't have rural anymore. It has suburban or peri-urban. And it's estimated that urban will be more than half of the population of South Asia by 2050. And in absolute numbers, it's striking. In 1950, there were 78 million people in urban settings in South Asia, and now it's 620 million. So this is an increase of eightfold over this period. This is a demographic change, of course, that is remarkable. But are the cities livable? Are these the kinds of cities that people want? Is the air breathable? Is the water drinkable? Are we poisoning ourselves? Are you creating a civilization of traffic jams for a century? Or a civilization of workable cities? The fourth dimension that is key is the geopolitical upheaval. We've definitely moved from a unipolar or a bipolar world, whether it was the Cold War world or the U.S. dominant world, to a multipolar world. The U.S. is surely in relative retreat, without question, at least relative. I think it's unambiguous. Absolute could be also, but we're now living in a world in which India, China, many other countries will be regional superpowers, and where global governance will be very difficult, by the way, because getting cooperation is always very hard, and whether we have the way to cooperate in this more and more complex world remains to be seen. And then the final megatrend is the unique environmental crisis of our time. And this is unique simply because of scale. I think it is true that humanity has a capacity to destroy the environment almost at any scale. Easter Island could make itself uninhabitable at small scale. Fatehpur Sikri could be abandoned centuries ago for lack of water supply. Soils erode, forests are deforested. What's special about our time is that this has reached the entire world. There is no place for migration left. There is no place for the new lands that will replace the tired old lands. For all of human history, we have destroyed forests and then moved into new terrain. There's nothing left. So we're where we are. There still are migrants, but no one wants them, no one likes them, and migrants tend to get shot at rather than welcomed when they are forced to migrate. And so the world's very crowded, and the environment is in big upheaval. And we have an almost unimaginable reality of humanity changing the fundamental air and ocean chemistry in a way which would have been laughable had it been suggested a half a century ago. We're making the oceans acidic, we're making the air laden with carbon dioxide, and we're changing the climate. And this is unique to our time, and our politicians are completely overwhelmed by it. If there's one principle, is they hate this issue. It runs against everything that they want to do. They want to grow economies, they want to make business, they want to stay in power, they want to look at the short term, they don't want to think about long-term challenges, complex scientific challenges, major transformational issues. Who's got time for that? Certainly not the politicians. This is a very big problem for us. There's awfully good news, and in my mind it is the technological revolution continuing. This is Moore's law, shown by the number of transistors on a microprocessor going from 2,000 to 5 billion from 1971 to 2013 for Intel's chips. It's transformed the world. One of the ways it's transformed the world is that everybody has mobile connectivity now. And I'd ask whether you feel in the rural areas in all of your countries, my guess is everyone's connected. In Africa, within the last 5 years, in the poorest places, everybody became connected. Everybody's got at least a flip phone, and smartphones are on their way in a lot of places, and it's quite an amazing revolution. And I think it's transformative, and very positively so in most of its dimensions. That's the best news for us. It means that it's possible to accomplish remarkable things. Just think of the rate of technological diffusion represented by this picture. There were 20,000 mobile phone subscribers in 1980, and now there's 7 billion. Never in history has technology been able to diffuse so rapidly as it can now. And this is why ancient scourges like extreme poverty really are remediable or solvable even in real time, in a time of 10 or 20 years. That would have seemed preposterous before. Now it seems simply tragic if we don't get the job done. And there are huge advances in other areas, also interlinked with information technology, but one of them is the improvement of solar cells, which is reduced in cost by a factor of 100 over the last 40 years. So this is another example of the power of technological advance. I'd like to think of our time as potentially being the 6th great wave of technology. Economic historians talk about Contradi of waves, the big technological waves that started with the steam engine and brought the Industrial Revolution. And we've gone through waves of rail, of electrification, of automobile age, of computation. And the question for us is, can we make a wave of sustainable technologies, low carbon energy systems, sustainable land and agronomic practices, sustainable cities that can be the next great wave of technological advance? And in my mind, the answer is yes. And one of the implications of that would be the end of extreme poverty. The poverty rate, as defined by the World Bank, has come down by more than half since 1990. China, India, and Sub-Saharan Africa have all experienced very significant declines of extreme poverty rates. Exactly how much is the great parlor game of economists, because we can debate specific numbers forever. But there's no doubt that extreme poverty is coming down. It could be ended. And one of probably the first Sustainable Development Goal, SDG number 1, will be end extreme poverty. So we should have a formal assignment by next September that will be priority number 1. The backdrop, though, to accomplish that is not simple. The demographic pressures are likely to remain intense. There still is rapid population growth. The world is 7.2 billion people as of now. It will be 8 billion by 2023 or 2024, 9 billion according to the medium fertility outlook of the UN by 2041, 10 billion by 2080, and almost 11 billion by the end of the century. That's a lot of people on a planet beset with huge environmental risks. I'm hoping that the lower curve, which is the low fertility rate curve, can be achieved, that would mean a faster decline of high total fertility rates, especially in Africa, but also in South Asia, that would allow the world population to peak at around 8.5 billion and then be perhaps 7 or 7.5 billion by the end of the century. It would be a happier planet and a less stressed planet if we can have the stabilization of the human population through voluntary fertility reduction. India is projected to become the most populous country in the world, of course, by about 2030. It will overtake China. The medium fertility forecast has India reaching a peak of about 1.75 billion and then beginning a gradual decline. The lower fertility rate would have a peak of around 1.4 billion and then a much faster decline. And I think India would be better off if it is able to achieve that demographic transition faster. But the real problem, beyond everything else, is the environmental crisis that is now absolutely upon us. We've been talking about this for 42 years since the first Stockholm Conference and Limits to Growth in 1972. 22 years ago was the Rio Earth Summit. We were told there's a collision between growth of the world economy and the physical environment. Nothing has been done yet because the dynamism of the world economy is strong, because the basic model of economic growth is follow the leader, and that means that the same fossil fuel-based development, the same style of automobile-led urbanization is spreading throughout the world. China's economic structure looks a lot more and more like the United States, but the US economic structure is absolutely unsustainable. I can tell you, I live there. It is not the end model by any means. In fact, it doesn't make sense for America, and it doesn't make sense for the world as a whole. But we've been on that path where every country follows the countries ahead in basic technological choices and strategy. The global production system unifies the world in basic technologies. There's not a lot of difference in our energy systems, for example. We're all using roughly the same technologies, just at different levels of intensity. And the result is that we're reaching planetary boundaries that are threatening our very survival. So the most important of these in this famous diagram of a few years ago is climate change at 12 noon. Climate change is profoundly threatening for the whole world, and South Asia is deeply threatened by climate change in multiple dimensions. Ocean acidification from the carbon dioxide loadings in the surface waters of the ocean is a second. The nitrogen and phosphorus poisoning of the waterways, like the Ganga or all of the river systems in this region. The river flow is way down because water is being diverted for irrigation and other uses, and yet the pollutants are way up. And so the ability to dissipate pollution is much reduced, and the river systems are poisoned. And this is a profound crisis. Groundwater depletion is another planetary boundary. India knows it fully. Land use and biodiversity loss, deforestation, destruction of species, major losses, massive loading of the atmosphere with aerosols. In other words, it's a mess. And it's a mess that we could have known about, but with the economy doubling every 10 to 20 years, and this has been going on now for decades, this is a mess that has reached reckless levels as of our time. The most dramatic of these is the carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere, which has reached 400 parts per million. This is a level of CO2 over the last 800,000 years. And you can see the arrow has just gone straight up, breaking out of the natural cycles driven by orbitals, by the Earth's orbit, to a complete spike of CO2 driven by fossil fuel use. We've had 3 months above 400 parts per million in the last 3 months. And this is the first time in 3 million years we've been at this level of CO2 concentrations. And the result, of course, is rising temperatures. The month of May, this past May, was the hottest May in recorded history. It's quite likely that 2015 is going to be the hottest year in recorded history, and we just have to step outside to remind ourselves of that because there's a massive heat wave going on and an overlay of an El Nino developing, and that will give an added boost to the temperatures. And the temperature anomalies for South Asia in the first week of June are quite stunning. You see all through the Tibetan Plateau, the Himalayas, and northern India and Southeast Asia, red. We have significant temperature anomalies. This is a very, very warm period. And while there's big uncertainties, the monsoons are seemingly weak again this year, perhaps the weakest in 5 years. Yesterday was supposed to be the beginning of the late arrival of the monsoon in Delhi, and as far as I know, there was no rain at all yesterday. I don't know whether there was even a drizzle, but there certainly was no monsoon break yesterday. And so there are huge environmental changes underway, and the buffers are very low. This is the satellite imagery using very fine gravitational measurements to assess groundwater depletion. And this is a famous paper from 2009 showing the massive depletion of groundwater in the Indo-Gangetic plains, Indo-Gangetic basin, which is that the dark red band of a huge decline of groundwater. Well, we're a very highly diverse region in the room today, so there's no simple storyline that covers all of South Asia. I put up my favorite climate categorization, the Köppen-Geiger climate system map, and it is important for us to remember the complexity of the region. We've got a lot here. Bangladesh, Sri Lanka are almost entirely tropical climate. India is diverse between tropics, drylands, and temperate. Bhutan and Nepal are so-called CW temperate, warm temperate or subtropical climate, and Afghanistan is a highland climate. But every country in the region is experiencing massive climate shocks and climate disruptions. Pakistan has had repeated drought over the last 10 years, and this is what's expected climatologically from the warming, especially in Pakistan's already dry areas. The basic rule of thumb of climate change is wet areas get wetter and dry areas get drier because of the intensification of the convective cycles that are driving the basic differences on the planet. And Pakistan is true to that with a significant drought, chronic drought in Sindh and the Thar Desert region. Bhutan is experiencing very significant glacier retreat, glacier lake outbursts. This is an example of trying to clear one of these dangerous growing glacier lakes to relieve the pressure, and there are a couple of dozen very vulnerable sites in Bhutan like this. In Sri Lanka, which is tropical, monsoon environment, massive, intense flooding. Bangladesh, of course, as a low-lying tropical delta, is at existential threat because half the country could basically become unviable if sea level rises by a meter, which is absolutely possible in this century. And crop production is under tremendous threat. Crops basically face two kinds of threats. One is water stress, and water stress is increasing for itself two reasons: faster evapotranspiration and declining precipitation in many areas. And the other stress on crops is thermal stress. When temperatures are too high, crops fail at various stages of crop production. And so we're experiencing already significant declines of yields in many tropical environments. And on this particular crop modeling exercise, you see that India is just one huge blotch of red, which in this particular paper means a significant decrease of crop productivity with a high modeling confidence of that fact. In other words, a threat of disaster. But this is happening all over the world, and I'm traveling all over the world in recent weeks and months to help establish this network. Every single place I go has environmental crisis. It's just stunning. I was in Brazil a couple of months ago. They have huge drought underway. You don't hear about it because the government absolutely explicitly said internally, not till after the World Cup. We don't discuss this. And so they're trying to get by without water running out before the World Cup's over. And then they're going to have to face drought conditions. There's drought in Southeast Asia, also related to the El Nino, because El Nino has a strong drought tendency in Indonesia in particular. We've had, of course, massive floods and superstorms in our neighborhood. This is Manhattan in our super hurricane Sandy, with the police cars floating down 10th Street in lower Manhattan. Beijing is enveloped in chronic, extraordinarily harmful smog. This was the particularly dramatic days of January, but it's coal-fired industrial production and power generation. Massive eutrophication off almost every delta area, but this is off the coast of northeast China. Massive storms like Typhoon Haiyan. And so the whole region is facing these tremendous environmental upheavals. So very briefly, just to conclude, we are entering an era where we need a holistic framework of economic, social, and environmental objectives. We need new governance. We need government driven by new metrics. GDP will not be an adequate measure of performance. And this is what the Sustainable Development Goals are after. The definition of the Sustainable Development Goals is still being negotiated. The SDSN at the global level made a recommendation of 10 goals last year. The Open Working Group of the United Nations General Assembly has identified 17 goals. We think there's a good mapping between what we recommended and these 17, and the intention is to get them down to a workable number like 10. But they involve poverty, gender equality, climate change, sustainable energy, ecosystem conservation, water management, and so forth. And the basic strategy that we're advocating is think ahead. which seems to be the hardest thing in the world for governments to do. They don't want to think ahead, and they don't want to be accountable to the future. But the job of the SDSN and the SDGs is both to create a framework of long-term thinking and planning, and to hold governments accountable for a longer-term agenda that is beyond politics. That's the hope. And it is to bring the best minds to bear, and it is to train the young generation in order to be able to face this challenge. So climate change, I know we'll talk about it, but it's an example. We need to move to a low-carbon energy system. All parts of the world are going to need to do that. How to do that? That's part of our ambition in this network, that every country think ahead about its energy system and how it's going to adjust in the 21st century. And we have a specific project called the Deep Decarbonization Pathways Project, which TERI is very much involved with. But I'd like every country in the region to be looking at a deep decarbonization pathway, not to stop economic growth, but to facilitate long-term, sustainable, clean, safe growth. Today we inaugurate the South Asia chapter of SDSN. You see Delhi and Dhaka circled on the map. I just want to let you know that this is part of a global effort, and your role will be very important in that. In recent months, we've started a Caribbean regional network, a Mediterranean Basin regional network, a West African regional network, a Central African regional network, an East Africa and Horn of Africa regional network, a Southeast Asian regional network, and an Australia and Pacific Island state regional network. This is a global, and an Amazon basin regional network. This is a global scale problem. We need global scale cooperation. South Asia is about a quarter of the world's population. It's a vital area for the world. It's vital for you to help lead this effort on a global scale as well. We're going to be talking today about some of the specific challenges for South Asia. I wanted to mention just a few that in my mind are near the top of the list. Health and education for all, job skills for young people, stabilized population, sustainable and resilient agriculture, sustainable cities, and sustainable energy, I would put as high on the list for us to consider. But of course, this is your agenda, and most important of all, the SDSN is for your purposes to help facilitate success in this region. And it's our hope and responsibility in the global SDSN to give you all the backing that you need, but also to tap on you for your global leadership as well. Thank you.